Good morning, fellow students. I am Dmitry Starchik from Human Morphology Department, the Northwest State Medical University, named after Mechnikov. And we have our lecture, the next lecture about the skull. And I am very glad to meet you again. It will be nice if you let me know about connection. I see only 4 people today, but I hope another students will join us very soon. Yes, all good. Thank you, Abdullah. And I'm ready to start. The today topic is the development and variability of the skull. We also will discuss the skull joints, what we can find in this part of the body. And we will start from skull development. The process of a skull development and its growth is carefully regulated. It is good regulated process. And a breakdown in regulation affects all body systems. This you can clearly see 10 and 16-week human fetuses have been specially stained. This is a special way of staining which give the bones a special color. And this method we call alizarin red. And also you see that all body parts are cleared. They are transparent in order to show developing skeletal elements and ossification process. At 10 weeks 10 weeks fetal skull clearly shows both stage. I hope you remember that in development there are two or three stages development of bones. It will be membrane stage, then cartilage stage, and then bone stage. And here you see the membrane stage where mostly all bones of the skull consist of membrane or connective tissue, and only some bones of the facial skeleton, like mandibular and maxilla, and some part of the orbit consist of the cartilage. And you see that the boundaries are the gaps between cartilage indicate the limits of future skull bones. And as you see, they are not, these boundaries are not good established. Another picture you see at 16 weeks fetal embryo, and here mostly all bones of the skull have margins, like you see the temporal bone, here is the parietal bone, as well as occipital bone and frontal bone, and very good the mandibular and maxilla are also very good visible here, and mostly bones consist of cartilage, but some of them are ossificated already. But if you take a look at the calvaria, at the neurocranium, you see the spots of the membrane or connective tissue, and it means that the process of development bones is still continuing. It's continuing. Well, I would also add that the mostly numbers of the bones of the skull are developed from the connective tissue and have only 2 stages, but some of the parts of the basic cranium bones, like the part of the occipital bones, the temporal bones, parts like pyramids and like processes mastoid, and some kind of part, the sphenoidal bones usually have 3 stages of development: membrane, cartilage, and bone stage. Here also the scheme of the development process of the skull, and here you see the different cartilage basic spot or group bones, what is gray, and from fertilization to about 8 weeks of age, and skull elements are composed of either mesenchyme in calvaria or hyaline cartilage in the cranial base. Usually the cranial base has the cartilage base, and the bony skeleton begins to form at 8 weeks. Here you see the 8 weeks, like the mostly bones have cartilage which replaced mesenchyme, and then the some of bones here, it's also good visible that cartilage part, but the calvaria, this is the membrane, here is membrane, here is cartilage, and the process of replacing the mesenchyme and cartilage is ossification. We call ossification, and here you see ossificated group in calvaria, and also ossificated group of bones in the cranial base. I hope you remember that calcification refers to the deposition of calcium salts within a tissue. We distinguish two major forms of ossification: intramembranosus ossification, and here you see intramembranosus ossification, when bones develops from mesenchyme or fibrous connective tissue, and intramembranosus ossification forms flat bones of calvaria and face, like frontal, parietal, and part of occipital bones. In endochondral ossification, bone replaced an existing cartilage model, and here you see the endochondral ossification in the maxilla, also here in mandibula, and the large part of the temporal bone is also endochondral, have also endochondral ossification. Usually, as I said, the bones of the cranial base develop by endochondral ossification. And in common, the skull development has three stages: membrane, when all bones are from the connective tissue. It takes place at age from 4 to 5 weeks. Then the second stage is cartilaginous stage, when bones consist mostly of cartilage. This stage starts from 6 weeks. You have to take in consideration that the both stage, during the second stage, we also have some bones which consist of membrane tissue or connective tissue, and then the bone stage, when we have from the 7 weeks, when the some bones of the skull are ossificated already. They start process of ossification. But in this stage also has the membrane parts, like here. Here is the membrane or connective tissue parts of bones. Here we see also cartilage. Here is cartilage parts, here and here, and also some parts are ossificated already, like here, here, and in the cranial base. After some period of fetal development, embryo consists of cartilage and mesenchyme arranged in thin plates around the developing brain. At birth, before delivering, bone formation is incomplete, and the mesenchyme filled spaces become dense connective tissue regions between the incompletely developed cranial bones called fontanels. Here you see the newborn skull with fontanels. This what we call fontanel. Fontanels is the connective tissue structures located between the ossificated bones. Commonly, they called soft spots. When we talk about fontanels, we mean that this is really soft places where ossified mesenchyme, here it is brown. This is a brown tissue here, and it develops into the dense connective tissue of the skull. Functionally, the fontanels serve as spaces for the growth of newborn skull bones, and they provide some flexibility to the fetal skull. The fontanels allow the skull to change shape as it passes through the birth canal in pelvis, and the fontanels permit a rapid growth of the brain during infancy. So the role, let me repeat it again, that the role of the fontanels is just to help fetal to come through, to pass through the female pelvis, because this process usually continues with the construction of the skull, and membranes spots as fontanels help this transportation, helps the delivery process to be easier. There are 6 large fontanels on the skull. Here you see anterior fontanels, also called frontalis fontans. In Latin, we call fontanels fonticulus, and this is the fonticulus anterior. Usually it is the largest fontanels, and it is the junction where the two frontal and two parietal bones meet. You see that during the embryogenesis, the frontal bone consists of two parts, right and left, and between two frontal and two parietal bones, the biggest fontanels is located. Usually the anterior fontanels remains soft until about 18 months to sometimes to 2 years of age, and usually when we touch this place on the head of the baby, we feel some pulsation, and doctors can assess if there is increased intracranial pressure by feeling the anterior fontanels. The posterior fontanels located, this is a junction between two parietal bones and occipital bones. As you see, these fontanels is not such such a large spot of membrane tissue, and it is located posteriorly in the median plate, posterior to the frontal. We also call the posterior fontanels as occipital fontanels, and this fontanel usually closes first before the anterior fontanels. Usually it happens during the first several months of an infant's life. Usually it is closed to 6 months, sometimes about to 3 months. And those were unpaired fontanels, but here you see paired, which has on the left and right sides the skull, and we call these the sphenoidal. Here is sphenoidal fontanels, and it is located between parietal bone, frontal bone, and temporal bone. And the mastoid fontanels is located between occipital, parietal, and temporal bones. It is named because here located the part of the temporal bones which called processus mastoid. And in term infants, the sphenoid and mastoid fontanels close before birth, before delivery process. They are closed already. And some of them newborn skull features or the differences between a newborn skull and adult skull is on this slide. There are 10 main newborn skull features, like the ratio between facial and cerebral skull is 1 to 8. It means that the volume of the facial part of the skull, or we call viscerocranium. Here is a viscerocranium. It is 8 time less than neurocranium, this part of the skull. And this is typical because in adult usually ratio between facial and cerebrals, between viscerocranium and neurocranium is 1 to 4. But the newborn skull is 1 to 8. The second feature is that the skull has a pentagonal shape. It looks like a pentagonal. Here you see angles 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Pentagonal shape is visible. It is visible on the superior view. We look at the skull from the superior. Frontal bone is that is the next feature. That frontal bone is divided by metopic suture. Here is a gap between two parts of the frontal bones, and we call it metopic suture. There are no superciliary arches. Usually, these part of these parts of the frontal bones located here, and they start to develop usually after delivery. Maxillary sinuses, the sinuses, all bones have no sinuses except maxilla. Usually this cavity is very, very small, not more than a half of milliliters, and it is also typical. All sinuses start after birth. Occipital bone consists of 4 parts connected by thin chondrosis. It's typical that inferior parts of the neurocranium bones consist of cartilages, and we call it when they join together, this is the thin chondrosis. Labyrinths of ethmoid bones. This is 7 features. Labyrinth of ethmoid bones are connected by thin chondrosis. I remember you that the ethmoid bones located here, and in this period of age, it is the thin chondrosis. It consists of the cartilage. Tympanic part of the temporal bone is incomplete, bony, and it looks like a ring, but not as a channel like in adults. Alveolar process of jaws are not expressed. It means that because there are the densest no teeth, and it is not necessary to have alveolar process. They start after the when thesis begins to grow, and very often mandible is still consisted of two halves, and usually this is a visible suture between two parts of mandible. Some differences we can name on the female and male skulls. What is the difference between men and women in skull? Male skulls usually are 10% heavier than female ones, because female skulls not they are lighter in weight, and usually it's typical when women are less than men in weight. Another feature is that areas of muscle attachment are more defined in men skull than in females. I mean such places where muscles attach to the bones, to the skull bones, like here. It's good visible that in male skull this place is bigger than in female. Also, the part of the zygomatic bone is large, like it's also has such difference. Some of the places, supraciliar arches located on the male skull are much more visible than in female. We call it supraciliar arches. And the frontal bones is curved posteriorly. Here visible that the plate of the frontal squama is just oriented posteriorly than in men than in female skulls. And usually it is also that the cavity of neurocranium, I mean the volume of neurocranium usually in man is 1,500 milliliters, but the volume of the female neurocranium is less. Usually it is 1,350 milliliters. Usually this is difference in 150 milliliters is between male and female. It doesn't mean that men are more intelligent than women. Absolutely. This is just difference in brain mass, in brain weight. Male, as I said, man has the ratio between the neurocranium and viscerocranium, and you see that this ratio of male skull and female skull, the ratio is here usually 4:1, and in female usually 4.5:1. In common, we would say that male skulls looks like primate skulls. It's sad, but I have to say it. I have to give you that fact. But female skull has pedomorphic features. It means that the female skulls look like baby, like children skull, but male skull look like primate. This is a monkey who were the sources of human development. It means, I'm sorry, but it means that male skull looks like monkey skull more than female ones. Good. And some differences, some age-related changes we see in the skull and during the development. Here you see the adult skull, but very old human, which and these differences very good visible, are good visible. Due to loss of teeth in alveolar process of upper and lower jaws are reduced. Here you see reduces places of the mandibular, but in senior skull we see no teeth, and that's why the maxilla and mandibular are reduces. There are no bones, small, only in such as alveolar process of the both jaws are less than in adult. The facial skull decreases in size relative to the neurocranium. It means that the volume of the viscerocranium in seniors and between the in comparison with the volume of neurocranium is bigger. Usually in adult we have ratio, I hope you remember, 1, 2, 4. But in seniors, this ratio is 1 to usually to 6. And also all cranial sutures are ossified. Here you see that there's no sutures, and mostly all of them ossified and not visible. And the lower jaw rises upward, and the chin protrudes forward. It means that part of the mandibula looks like protrudes. It is not plate like in the adult skull. A couple of words I have to say about skull variability, because we have differences. Usually that is the typical process when the skulls are asymmetric. Sometimes it is very good visible, like here, when the right half of skull is less than left one. But when the skull and asymmetry as a process is typical for all skull, more or less all skull are asymmetric, but sometimes we find totally symmetric skulls, like on the picture B, and that is named paradoxical. It means that symmetry is the paradox. It happens more rare than the asymmetry process. Some of the skull remained the metopic suture. It means that like in newborn, like in fetus, the frontal bone consists of two parts, left and right, and we call such skulls, when the adult have this suture, we call metopic skulls, and this suture is named suture metopica. The another variability of the skull is double parietal bone. There is the suture between superior and inferior parts of the parietal bones, and we call it os parietale bipartitum in Latin. It means it has two parts. Then we also find variability on the posterior part of the bone, and these differences in the occipital bone. Sometimes we find the additional bone located posteriorly, Sometimes we find two or three, like it is visible here, two or three additional part of this occipital bone. And the common name of these additional bones is inchi bones. I hope you remember that inchi is the people lived in South America, and such bones were found firstly in the Latin America, and the Spanish decided that it is typical only for the Indians used to live there, but we find such additional occipital bones also in Europe, in Asia, everywhere. So, but the name is still used. Os inchi means the additional bones, additional occipital bones. When the process of development go wrong, we have anomalies and deformations. Firstly, I should to classificate skull deformation regarding Professor Bystrov, Alexei Bystrov, who was the great Russian anthropologist, and a lot of he was artist and wrote a lot of picture for human anatomy book, human anatomy student book. And regarding Bystrov, regarding Professor Bystrov, all skull deformations we divide on two group: natural deformations and artificial deformations. Natural deformations developed as a result of premature overgrowth of the seams of the cerebral skull, or they are a result of endocrine diseases. Sometimes we call it craniostenosis. Usually this is a process which take places by the some natural processes, natural based of the development. But artificial deformations, usually they are a result of bandaging or the imposition of special devices to the skull. They take place for cult and religious purposes. Let's see some natural deformations. Here there are two pictures produced by Professor Bystrov, and here is the craniostenosis of the, here is no coronal suture, and as a result the growth of the right part of the neurocranium, and it is bigger than left one. Here is the craniostenosis of the left part of the coronal suture, and there is no sagittal suture at all, and as a result these parts is the shape is like a bubble on the right side of the frontal bones, and the total length of or the diameter rectus, or the distance between frontal and occipital bone, are bigger than at normal skulls. Here is the scaphocephaly when there is no sagittal suture, and it comes to the such deformation when skull grows anteriorly and posteriorly. Professor Bystrov also described the maximal scaphocephaly, maximal scaphocephaly, called statin weaver. It was he was a real person, lived in Stettin. This is a small city in the Czech Republic, and this man has unusually strong degree of scaphocephaly. He was a worker in one of the weaving factories in Stettin, and his skull was so long and narrow that the back of his head, this part, rested against his back when the unfortunate man tried to raise his head. So it means that this man, he could not see, could not could not look at the sky, because this part of it does this part of the posterior part of the skull didn't allow him to look up. And then another form. Алло? Сергей Анатольевич, здравствуйте, да. Да. Мы готовы. Угу. Угу. Да. Она... Да. Можно. Было. Да. Федоренко. Угу. Это в какой... 25. Да, хорошо, я понял. Канисимую, на Кирочную, понятно. Я понял. Угу. Хорошо, сначала к Федоренко, потом к Анисимовой. Да. Угу. Мгм. Хорошо, Сергей Анатольевич, я понял. Сейчас лекцию закончу, я ей перезвоню и да, спасибо, все, да, сделаем, спасибо. Мгм. I'm sorry. Sorry for interrupting. And this is another form of uh, skull deformation called hypsicephalia, when the neurocranium protrudes superiorly. This process it takes place when early overgrowth of the coronal and some part of the sagittal sutures. Artificial deformation take place in different parts of the walls, and usually they connected with the bandage which people put on the neurocranium, and it gives the as a result the tall skull. We call it like like um, like this is a uh, mm, vertical oriented skull. Interesting picture you see in Africa. Some of the some of the some of the people living in Africa put the bandage on the skull. It takes place in different part of the world, not in Africa, and also in Europe. The scientists found such skulls in South and North America, in Europe, even in Asia, everywhere. But an interesting form of the skull deformations the scientists found in Latin America, in Mexican region, and we call it the Mexican variant of deformation, and we consider that it was a special unit what was used for that deformation. And skull anomalies also take place during the development when it went wrong, and the heaviest anomalies we call anencephaly is it is accompanied by extensive defects of the calvaria, so there is no brain at all, and it is visible that neurocranium is very small in comparison with the viscerocranium here. Usually the parietal bones are absent, and frontal and occipital bones are underdeveloped. Next anomalies when the neurocranium is small but it is also, the brain is also very small, and we call it microcephaly. Microcephaly is a decreasing in the cerebral part of the small. Here anomaly we call hydrocephaly. This is it takes place when there is no connection between brain ventricles, between fourth ventricles and the fluid from the internal cavities of the brain. It is not possible the normal the normal circulation is not possible, and it comes to the volume of the brain is bigger, and it is also visible that the neurocranium is much bigger than viscerocranium. Such children should be operated. By the way, this baby with the name Anton was operated, and now he everything is fine with him. Such anomalies like dicephalus means that the baby has two heads on one body, and it is very rare anomalies. Some of the hernias occur with the congenital defects, and it may be on the frontal part, and sometimes we find the hernia on the occipital bone. Usually that's hard process, and also such babies need to be operated. Skull anomalies when the lips is one or two sides defects, and it's called the gap, lip gap, or we call it labium laparinum in Latin. Usually this is a defect, but it have to be also operated, because it make a problem with the normal processes, normal taking food or breathing. But the another variant when the not only lip gap but also the cleft palate, when in the palatum durum we find the gap, and this is gap is connected. It's connect the oral cavity and nasal cavity. And in the end of our lecture, I'd like to tell you about skull joints. How is possible? What is the joints? What is the connection between the skull bones? We distinguish two group of joints of the skull. First one is synarthrosis. Usually is Федор, на лекции перезвоню. And this is first. This group consists of fibrosis joints. We call it also syndesmosis. Fibrosis joints means that all of these joints consist of the connective tissue. We find sutures, spondylosis, and kyphosis. All of these joints are membrane or connective tissue joints. Then cartilaginous joints, another name is synchondrosis. They may be temporary, and it means that transform in the ossification in the bones, but permanent, it means we find such cartilagens all the time during whole human life. And bone joints, usually all of previous fibrosis and cartilage joints come to the bone joints, and this process we call ossification. This is the ossificated bones. And the second group of joints called diarthrosis. This is a real joints. We find temporomandibular joint between temporal bone and mandibula, and connection between occipital bones and first vertebra, cervical vertebra. There are three joints and with named Atlanta occipital joints. Let's take a look to the synarthrosis. First, sutures. Sutures between skull bones may be serrate, like dents. We call it sutura dentatus. Squamous sutures, they look like fish plates, and this is the oblique connection between bones. And plane sutures, when the contact is like a plate. Dental-alveolar syndesmosis is a connection between teeth and alveolar process, and this is the connection between tooth and socket of alveolar process, and this is the layer of connective tissue which helps to fix tooth into the jaw between maxilla and mandibula. And I see if the people lose this connective tissue, I mean here, when the microbes or bacterium or some of dysregulation take place, it follow to the such process which called parodontosis. This is a periodontal diseases, and as you see, it is very easy to remove tooth because there is no connective tissue at all. That is heart diseases, and it follows to the losing of almost all teeth. Spondylosis is the connection between split bone, and usually it is like we found such joints between nasal septum and palate, and between the rostrum of the sphenoid bone and perpendicular plate of the ethmoid bones. That is when one bone has a split and another bone come in connection with the splitted bones, and that is the common name is spondylosis. and usually we find skin delosis only on the between the facial facial bones of the skull. Synarthrosis, cartilaginous joints located on the base cranium, and between occipital and sphenoidal bones. The permanent synchondrosis called sphenoid stony synchondrosis is between the sphenoid bone and the pyramid of the temporal bone, and some other. And you have to learn also skull diarthrosis. First one is the temporomandibular joint, which is located on the lateral part of the bone between mandibula and os temporal or temporal bone. And here you see articular surface. First one is a condylar process of the mandibula, and second upper surface is mandibular fossa and articular tubercle. Here is articular tubercle and mandibular fossa. So only two surfaces, articular surfaces. There are two articular surfaces in the temporomandibular joints. Between these surfaces we find articular disc. That's typical for this bond. In classification, we classify the temporal mandibular joints as the bicondylar joints, biaxial joints. This is in the axis. It means that two axes this joint has, but the shape of the surfaces are bicondylar. And it is also combined joints. It means that the right and left temporomandibular joints move together. It is not possible when the right joints is moved, but the left is stopped. They have combined functional, and such joints we call combined joints. As I said, typically articular disc we find in the articular cavity, and this disc consists of fibrocartilage. It means this is a combination connective tissue and cartilage, and such discs are very strong, and it divides and separates synovial cavity into superior cavity and inferior cavity, and these cavities have different sizes, and as you see, the thickness of the disc is 1 millimeter in the centrum here, but the peripheral parts of the disc are larger and has thickness about 2 millimeters, 2 or 3 millimeters. Usually such joints which have disc or menisc inside we call complex joints. And as a function of the disc, we would say that it give alignment of discrepancy between articular surfaces, and it helps to showing movements. In common, I would say that articular disc gives more congruent, it allows the joints to move smoothly. Here, this articular surface on the temporal bones, and punctured line, dotted line shows the place of connecting articular capsula. Some of the ligament we find in the temporomandibular joints. Usually there are some of interarticular ligaments, anterior and posterior, and they're located in the articular capsula here. Some of the ligament located laterally, and this is the lateral ligament located and fix the temporomandibular joint laterally, and some of the ligament connect the bones like sphenoidal bones with mandibula, and we call such ligament extra articular ligament. One of them is sphenomandibular ligament, and also another one extra articular ligament located between processes styloid process and angle of mandibula, and this ligament called stylomandibular ligament. Movement in the temporomandibular joints takes two phases. We distinguish two phases. Here you see the closed mandibula, but the first stage, when the mandibula move down or open, when we open the mouth, is up to 15 degrees. The angle is 15 degrees, and usually it takes place in the inferior cavity between the mandibula and disc. When people open mouth more than 15 degrees, then the disc moves anteriorly, and this movement takes place in the superior part of the cavity. Such movement we call depression. This is a depression, and opposite movements we call elevation, when lower jaw is closed. And as you see, this is a two stage in each movements, two stage in depression and two stage in elevation, and it depends on the angle we move. Another movements in the joints called protraction and retraction. Protraction or protrusion is when the both their move toward movement in both joints, in left and right, and it takes place in upper floor of the temporomandibular joints when the two discs move forward. And the third kind of movements in the temporomandibular joints is the lateral displacement, when one joints, for example right joints, is protruded, but the left one is rotated, and the mandibular moves left. Opposite another movement is when the left joints is moved anteriorly, but the right joint is rotated. Here also connection between occipital bone and atlant, the first cervical vertebra, and here you see articular surfaces between, and you see two surfaces on the atlant, symmetrical, and two surfaces on the occipital bone, and there are two joints, atlant occipital left and right, and these joints, the gap of these joints located between quite good congruated surfaces, and these atlanto-occipital bones are condylar joints, rather bicondylar joints. We call it bicondylar. Maybe better is to call it bicondylar joints. That is, those are simple joints. It means this is the only two articular surfaces, and every joint has two axes. Such joints we call biaxial, and this axis is sagittal and frontal axis. I would say that atlanto-occipital joints are combined joints. There is no moving in left joints without moving in the right joints. They move together. All movements are possible in both atlanto-occipital joints, but not in only one. And some of them ligament fix these atlanto-occipital joints. This is the anterior, anterior membrane between anterior arch of the atlant and basic part of the occipital bones, and there is also posterior membrane between the posterior arch of the vertebra and occipital bone. And movements in the atlanto-occipital bones, we can move the head anteriorly to like a take knock, and posteriorly, anterior and posterior, lateral movement, but there is no rotation. Don't say that Atlant occipital movements give us the rotation in the head. It done between the first and second cervical vertebra, but not between occipital and atlant. Okay, that's all for now. If you have question, you can put your question in our forum, or don't hesitate to email me. That I also have to recommend you to pass the test. Today's test is located in Moodle, and it is connected with the today topic. I recommend you to do it today. The test will be opened till 19 today. If you have no question, then let me thank you for your attention. It was nice to meet you again, and I hope we will meet all December. Now we will have lecture from 9 a.m. in Moscow time. And yes, as I see there are no questions today, then let me say you goodbye and wish you good luck in your test. Thank you and see you later.